Public schools were supposed to be engines of democracy, but they often turned out to be protectors of inequality.
In order to be a citizen in this country now, you have to have a much higher level of quantitative literacy.
Money alone is probably not going to totally, it's how you spend the money. And how you...
First you have to have it
in order to spend it.
but
then you have to spend it.
Just want to make that clear.
Well, to be even more specific, one of the things that you encouraged was putting more minority students into advanced classes and AP classes. And if my understanding is correct, you ran into some resistance from teachers who did not believe that those students could perform in those classes.
That's right.
Now,
teachers and leaders were extremely important. And Steve, you might comment on this. Principals were critical. Unfortunately, I had to replace about 90% of the principals because they were old school. Tell you what to do, command and control. You have to move into a new collaborative environment where the conditions are set, where the culture of the school becomes a learning one with high expectations. The pathway was there. If it's there for 25%, how do we make it there for 90%? Well, first of all, you got to knock down the barriers. You've got to start earlier. You've got to use time better. But you also have to give children access. So it's access plus equity, plus high quality will get you to the end result. You don't have access, you won't get your volume. You don't have equity, you won't get your different children. And we raised 4, they all needed a different way of doing things. I had a daughter that I could just raise my voice and, I was yelling at her. And I had a son that you probably, I don't know what would work, but he finally grew out of it. He's become he's a very high quality professional now, but raising was a challenge.
And I'm hoping he's watching this. Okay,
yeah.
So I'm gonna cut this here because we're gonna come back to what the lessons in Montgomery County seem to have been. And I want to just tuck one more thought in your mind here, something we haven't said, but it relates to issues of resources, it relates to expectations, it relates to system, and that's the extent to which we're providing the early childhood education in this country that we need to be providing to actually support high expectations and use resources well. Let's come back to that in a few moments. Right now, it's often been said that the prejudices and inequalities that affect schools today start in society. And that as long as we have racism in our communities, as long as we have poverty in our communities, we won't be able to provide a fair education in schools. This is kind of the structuralist argument. You're just not going to be able to do it as long as society is corrupt as it is. We asked a number of educators and community activists about that. Let's watch for just a second.
The notion or the battle of thinking, can you fix educational outcomes until you fix poverty? To me, is a question of the chicken or an egg.
Schools and what happens in schools is, in a lot of ways, the manifestation of what's happening in those communities.
Poverty is absolutely impactful on education.
That said, poverty can also be used as an excuse for schools not to do the work they need to do when it gets hard.
There's many schools in the city of Chicago alone that have proven that you can have a student demographic that is predominantly living below the poverty line, but still improve the performance of those students and make sure that they have a quality education.
We can't say that until poverty is fixed, schools are never going to be able to serve their kids well. That is a false paradigm.
I think to wait to fix poverty, that then address education is to wait forever.
I'm reminded of a doctoral student colleague of mine when I was in grad school who, while all the rest of us were talking about what we wanted to do with our doctoral degrees, he was silent. And I finally turned to him, I said, Dale, what are your aspirations? And he said, look, nothing we do is going to make a difference as long as the society is corrupt as it is. I'm waiting for the revolution. Now, I'm talking with 3 educators who are not waiting for the revolution. So
no, you can do it now.
Jerry, talk to us a little bit about Montgomery County.
You can't, well, it could be in Alline, Texas, it could be in Portland, Oregon, it could be in Long Beach, California. I can take you around and show you places that aren't accepting that paradigm. We can't be, as we say in the South, fixing to get ready. It's the only shot these kids have. So you do have to figure out how to utilize your resources. First, you need more resources, but you need to utilize your resources that you have well. One of the resources you have is time. The other resource you have is human resource. So how you organize those resources and the level of expectations you have fit along this pathway that the children who have gone to higher education or quality jobs are walking on. You have to build a culture and structures that get more kids on that pathway. You do that by improving quality teachers. Quality leaders are very important because teachers won't work very long for a poor quality leader. And a poor quality leader makes a huge difference in a school. That's why you have some individual schools doing well. Whether they're public or private or charter, you know, that leader is huge in the outcomes. So how do we grow more of those? How do we support them? How do we listen to what children and parents want? And how do we knock down these access barriers? How do we deal with the effects of racism? How do we do the expectation piece? Those are all strategic questions that you have to start thinking about answers for when you're running a school system. It's very complex, but yet it is very doable. But you can't do it without your people. I am so appalled by how leaders talk about their employees. I am so appalled and about how do you think you're going to get anything done without your employees forming in and believing in it and lining up to do it. We talk about Montgomery County, and I'm pleased with that. I didn't do anything. The employees did it. I allowed them to structure where they could communicate. I allowed them to build the early childhood programs. I supported them. I listened to them and tried to solve their problems, not my problems. I didn't bring a program, a project, or a guru in. You know, we had the capacity within. We just needed to read and learn.
And well, you also reallocated resources within the county.
Oh, I totally reallocated resources politically.
So that the places where kids had greater needs got smaller class sizes, got incentives for experienced teachers to come and stay, got investments in professional learning. So all of those things you said, plus those allocations of resources, which often don't go on in big city districts. You know, the parents with the most clout have often lobbied for schools that even within a given district, there are differences in what's available.
We taught poor parents to kick our butt just as well as rich parents did.
That's a great strategy.
You know, and what we did was differentiate the size of class so teachers could get the span. We give 20 extra days of training to teachers who are working in the children's schools who were affected by mobility, which nobody seems to talk about, because you can fix this school, but these kids move around. Been in on the housing project. You've got to fix a whole territory. We spent 4 years retraining leaders to work in these schools, very much like your program here is at, Steve. We actually used your research. We read it, we used it, and we put it in teacher talk where people could understand it. So it was applied research, okay? Well, you guys write for each other, you know. I mean,
So look, Linda and Charles.
We can't take it sitting down anyway.
Since neither of you is waiting for the revolution, where does the greatest leverage lie in really making a difference in closing some of these equity gaps, in closing the instructional gaps that are in fact serving so many of our kids so poorly? Where does our greatest leverage lie in the face of a society that's weak on resources, et cetera? Go ahead.
Well, I think we've started to talk about some of those, but I'll add another dimension of it. Part of the work that I do is in teacher education. And, you know, we're talking about what you need teachers to be able to do. There are two pieces of that that are just really important. And in our work at Stanford, we've started new schools. We've worked with schools to reform what they do. I've personally been involved in starting schools in high-need communities where we can train teachers to have the best practices to meet the needs of the kids in that community, rather than going off and either training in a place where the kids are very affluent but they won't be able to carry the skills to the places they want to go, or where they see diverse student population and learn bad practices that they're modeled on what they already see. So you have to figure out how both to create a curriculum in which all the kids get the good stuff. That is a curriculum in which the work is authentic, it is meaningful, it is intellectually challenging, the kids are involved in inquiry and problem solving and taking agency in their learning. That's usually been restricted in a lot of districts for some tier of gifted and talented or otherwise labeled classes in some schools, and the other stuff has been sitting in a desk doing worksheets that are not connected to any meaningful intellectual activity or linked learning in the community. So to teach in that way for all kids, you have to understand what the kind of high status knowledge and applied learning is like, how to do that, and then how to do it in heterogeneous classes where you're working with a wide variety of kids who have different language backgrounds, different community, cultural backgrounds, different experiences prior to coming to your classroom or into your school. And so teaching for diversity and teaching for this deep understanding and applied knowledge is a skill set that relatively few teachers get access to. And some schools of education have designed their programs to enable people to learn that, and then leaders need to be able to cultivate that kind of learning for everyone. It means detracking. We have a very track system. One of the things you see in high achieving countries that 35, 40 years ago didn't even have an education system to speak of are that they built a detract system where kids are getting the same good stuff, the same 21st century oriented curriculum from the time they enter school, good preschool, where they're also learning to be agents of their own knowledge production and learning all the way through. Now sometimes there's a sort in high school where kids then go into different pathways, but that is now common in places like Finland and Singapore, and you could go down the list. We're more tracked in the supposedly equitable United States of America than many of the countries that 40 years ago had only 10% of their population getting any kind of secondary school.
Tracked and resegregated.
And
it's color-coded.
Yeah.
The
it's
color-coded.
color-coded.
Well, we're going to come back to the issue of race in just a minute. I'm going to start with Charles on it because he raised that question first of all. A well-known problem is that kids in the poorest communities also have the least amount of dollars spent on their education, and the poverty of communities itself is color-coded, right?
Right.
When school reformers say more resources are needed, it's often said, and this kind of came up early in our discussion, it's often said, you know what, you can't just throw money at this problem. That's not going to do it. There's a half-truth there, right? That money itself won't do it. But let's look at what some of the educators and community members from Chicago have said about this. You can't throw money at the problem.
Well, there's always a myth that funding doesn't matter, that you can throw money at problems and it doesn't always fix it.
Look, there's no question that fixing what ails our schools is bigger than just throwing money at it. In fact, we've put a lot more money into schools, both here and across the country, and we haven't always seen results.
There are countries that don't have the type of resources that we do, that do a really good job of educating their children.
Well, there's some truth to that, maybe at some higher level, but not when we're so, funding at such a disparate level that we're currently funding, when the gaps are so wide.
We're coming to a point where resources are becoming so scarce that schools are making decisions as to whether or not to combine grade level classrooms and have 40 to 50 children in a room. That's the situation we are in the city of Chicago. That matters.
Resources certainly matter, but how you leverage those resources is more important and matters the most.
Money absolutely matters, and anybody who thinks it doesn't isn't really paying attention.
Charles, Chicago's 90% black and brown kids. The state of Illinois is the single most demographically representative state in the union. We look more like the union overall than any other single state does. We face issues of race, poverty, that are similar nationwide. How is it that we can find leverage in a school system that's under-resourced, underfunded, and has 90% black and brown kids as a student in the system? Where does the leverage lie for you?
I don't want to answer that question.
All right.
I want to answer.
Go for it.
I want to speak to this money doesn't matter discourse, right?
Yeah.
50 years now, since the Coleman Report, we have been dealing with this. It is, in point of fact, a racist discourse, right? Nobody's saying that up on Winnetka. Nobody's saying that up on the North Shore. What that question means, why that question survives, is that it is plausible in the minds of many people that poor children of color are so damaged that money does not matter for them. That is what this discourse is saying, right? You take that out and nobody else is talking about this, right? So, I mean, and obviously it reflects on something that really does go back to your issue about leverage. When we talk about resources, everybody thinks we mean money, and of course we do, but we also mean human capital.
Right.
But we also mean social capital, and one form of social capital is honor, the degree to which people think you are capable. And a lot of what our children lack in Chicago at the classroom level, at the level of the city, at the level of the state government, where the state legislature has been for decades saying we want to send money to Chicago because that's throwing money into a black hole. They don't believe our children and our teachers have capacity, right? They don't give them that honor. And that a part of the reason it's so difficult to get traction when you do have leverage is that you're swimming upstream because of that social context. I mean, that's one way to answer it. I mean, the other.
No, yeah. Go ahead.
Since I'm looking at
Finish
you,
your other one, yeah.
Yeah.
it's, and I always get frustrated when I hear Dr. Weast talk. His teacher did it. His teacher did it. His teacher did it. His teachers came on, right?
Yeah.
But his story, you know, all of the stories we have of successful districts are stories of leadership, right? And I don't want that to get lost in his modesty, which I respect and admire. This is leadership, and this is about people who are willing to take hits. These are about people who have a vision, and certainly in his case, people had a vision of what professional teachers could do if they were challenged and supported, right?
They're one of the highest educated workforces that are in any community. And we treat them like dirt in many places. I want to go back to your leverage points. Yes, so let's take resources and let's say, how would you use the resources you're given if you're going to attract and attack this problem? Well, one, a high leverage point is early childhood education. Cost you less? No. You need to spend some real money on early childhood education, catching them at birth. Because poor babies are not born in all hospitals, folks. Poor babies don't live in all areas of your community. You've got to saturate that area and help parents learn through parent academies and teaching each other. You've got to have weekly programs about how to do that. You know, work with your children. You've got to utilize your social services and surround them. But more importantly, you've got to teach the language and numeracy skills that these children are going to need when they hit kindergarten. Because the children who make it through in 6 years or less, and we did a lot of study on this, were reading in kindergarten. We're reading at a level, text level on the reading recovery, which was one of the most studied programs in the country, at 4 or 6. Because what we did was follow our graduates and then reverse engineer what did those graduates do in kindergarten. Well, you can't wait till kindergarten to get that ready if you're going to hit that. That correlated with they were able to do certain things in the 2nd and 3rd grade. Now, the 3rd grade, all teachers will tell you, that's when the testing regime comes on. The sorting, if you will, or the reinforcement that, okay, we're not going to spend money on you because you're not making progress. That happens down there. That 720 days is more important than the 720 days you're spending in high school. So it is about time and utilization of time. A next high leverage resource that you can take systemically through your state is retraining your principals. That was critical because there is very little spent on leadership training, and the type of leadership training they're getting is not the type they need to work in a new collaborative environment if you're going to turn your teachers on where they want to be participants. So you need good educational leaders. A third thing is that you've got to make the job of teaching a job that seems doable to the teacher. You're stacking 40 kids in a classroom and you're putting everybody in there with all kinds of issues. That's not a doable job. They'll try, but that happens in your high poverty districts. I didn't see that happening in wealthy districts I've been studying in the last 5 years. I see smaller class size, so we should treat everybody differently if you're going to hit those expectations. Then I see so little capacity building. We think that they're done when they come out of college. That's just the beginning. They don't do that in the law profession, the medical profession, any of the other professions. You have to have ongoing. And I'm not talking about sit and get and make and take. I'm talking about embedded development from master teachers led by an excellent principal with a structure where you can actually collaborate and learn from each other. You do that and put a pathway forward that has predictive metrics in it, bingo. You start gaining people who can access high-level courses and rigorous courses when they get to high school. And they do not feel like that they're acting some other way by doing it. They feel comfortable by doing it.
Jerry, let me just do the following, because we reserved a place on the program here for Jerry to say a word about what was the Montgomery County that he inherited, because most of our viewers don't know the setting about which he's speaking here. What was the Montgomery County that you inherited as a school system, A, and then B, what was it when you left it? And then I want to come back to your comment.
Well, it was 50 to 60% white. And when I left it, it was 20 to 30%, somewhere in the 30% neighborhood. It had pretty good scores when I came. It had excellent scores when I left. 70% of the children were taking either ACT or SAT, and they were either scoring 24 or 1650. 1650 was the average. And they didn't do it 1 year or 2 years, and after I left 5 years ago, it continued. This is something that you build, and I stayed 12 years, so I wanted to go through with these kids. You build the early childhood program, you build a coherent program in the elementary school, you build a feeder system pathway that is predictable, you give people a chance to solve their problems, and you listen to them, and you don't hate your labor, you love your labor force, you train your principals, you'll start to get much better outcomes. And we had the 9th largest African American population at the secondary school in the country. And we had the highest number of African Americans in the country, except for New York City, which is 9 times larger than we were, that could pass an AP test with a 3 or better, which was a 74% indicator or greater that they would get out of college in 6 years or less. So the Latino population, the poverty population, the African American population grew, and the scores grew, and we went through the recession and had to make the cuts like everybody else. It is teacher leader capacity, high expectations, starting early, rigorous kinds of outcomes, predictable measures, and changing what you do if it doesn't work.
Linda, you had a remark, and then we're going to take one quick one from Charles, then we're going to go to the audience, and we're going to have a few minutes of audience questions. Linda.
So my kids went to school in Montgomery County before Jerry was there. And we lived in the down county area, which was predominantly black at that time, became more Latino later. And the inequities within the county were very obvious, and you dealt with a number of those inequities after you came. But Montgomery County did at that time almost twice as much as Baltimore City. So the inequities, you could do a lot of, what Jerry did was spend those resources much more equitably.
Yes.
But it is one of the higher resourced counties in the country, and certainly in Maryland and in that region. So I wanted to just kind of reinforce.
Not so much anymore.
Maybe that's changed a little, but it certainly helps to have the resources that you then can distribute equitably. On this point of where the leverage points are, absolutely preschool makes a huge difference. There was a study in Johns Hopkins which found that if you look at the gap in achievement between 9th graders who are wealthy and less wealthy at that point in time, about a third of that gap existed before kindergarten, which can be greatly decreased with preschool. Almost the entire rest of the gap could be explained by summer learning loss. So another high leverage place to invest is in the kinds of experiences, enriched experiences year round that will prevent that summer learning loss. And that was one big part of what The investments were in the 60s and 70s, when we had a war on poverty, when we had a Great Society movement, when we made a lot of headway on closing the achievement gap. We closed the black-white achievement gap in reading by 2/3 in that period of time. And if all those programs had not been wiped out in the 1980s, we would have closed the achievement gap by the year 2000. But what happened when a lot of those programs were eliminated was that the achievement gap grew again. And then in most places, outside of places like Montgomery County or Long Beach, it has stayed. But the money makes a difference question that Charles made us re-engage is critical. And I think your explanation is exactly right. Recent study by Kirabo Jackson and Rucker Johnson looked at the places where there had been school finance reforms over 40 years across thousands and thousands of children. And they found that where those reforms added 20% to the school resources for low-income kids, and that's not a huge amount of money because at the time they were studying, average per pupil expenditures were about $8,000, so you're talking $1,600 per, and leveled them up to the closer to the levels that were spent on wealthier communities. Graduation rates increased by 20 percentage points. Adult poverty gap was completely erased. Wages went up for individuals by 25% and for families by 52%. So money can make a difference, when it is, properly used. And so this argument that it doesn't matter is only made when it comes to the education of low-income children of color. And we can't allow that argument to continue to
a nice illustration of that is if money didn't matter, wealthier suburbs would be quite content for us to reduce the funding levels of their schools.
Yeah, right.
And of course, there's not a single one of them that would support that.
Yeah,
right?
rich people are never, when they say money doesn't matter, they're never giving their money away to say,
Well, and you find the same thing when we had a lot of private schools. And I never heard too many people complain about the private school tuition.
Right.
And what we've got to do is to understand that we have to be more egalitarian. That's a nice word. I don't see much practice of it. I don't see much practice of sharing of resources. What I see is people wanting a competitive edge for their child. And what you have to do is you have to have a social argument for this more money, but you have to have an economic argument. What I'm worried about is what we started this program with, these kids getting jobs, these kids having a livelihood, these kids having the efficacy of continuing to learn because they're going to have to learn how to learn because everything's going to be changing. You can't do that by leaving a substantial amount of your population behind.
Charter schools are new and shiny and draw in a lot of students, and hence we are losing in enrollment, which reduces the amount of money that we have to fund programs.